What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to InvestQ. And I got a good video over here for you guys on the channel for Castellum CTM. And usually, when we cover any stock on this channel, usually I'm just talking about one company, one contract. I'm only covering one earnings report or one specific catalyst alone. But today, I want to zoom out and take a look at the bigger picture because over the last several weeks, I've spent a lot of time reading through Department of Defense announcements, congressional budget proposals, government procurement documents, executive orders, company SEC filings, and industry news. And after putting all of those pieces together, I realized that there's a much bigger story that often gets overlooked. Now, before we get started, I do want to give a quick shout out to one of the investors in the defense space, Mo, also known as MOUNWP. And over the last several weeks, watching some of his due diligence and seeing the way he approaches researching government contractors really encouraged me to start digging much deeper myself. And instead of just reading company press releases, I found myself going through Department of Defense documents, congressional budget proposals, procurement information, executive orders, and a lot of publicly available government resources. So I definitely want to give credit where credit is due because that push to look beyond the headlines is what inspired me to put this entire video together. And of course, everything that we are discussing today comes from publicly available information, and any opinions or conclusions I share are my own. I just wanted to acknowledge that the person who encouraged me to start digging deeper into this side of the defense industry. So Mo, if you're watching this, thank you. Now, let's jump into the video. Now, when most investors hear that a defense company won a contract, they naturally focus on the company, how much the contract is worth, and they ask, is the revenue going to increase? Is this bullish for the stock? And even though that those are fair questions, I want to tell you something else. What if I told you that by the time a company announces a contract, that story actually started months ago and sometimes even years ago before the press release was ever even published? That's what I want to talk about today because after digging through all of this information, I realized defense investing isn't just about following individual companies. It's about understanding the entire ecosystem that they operate in, and everything starts with national security. Before the Department of Defense buys anything, before Congress approves funding, before companies submit proposals, the government first has to answer one very important question. And that question would be, what problems are we trying to solve? And if you start reading through enough government reports, you'll start to notice the same things appearing over and over again. You're going to see things about artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, software modernization, supply chain resilience, cloud computing, electronic warfare, space, critical infrastructure, China, and Russia. And these are not just random buzzwords, they're the priorities that are shaping where defense spending is headed. So, for example, one executive order I came across discussed using artificial intelligence to strengthen America's defense supply chain. Now, I want you to think about that for a second. The government isn't simply looking at AI as something that can generate text or create images. They're looking at artificial intelligence as a tool that can identify weaknesses in supply chains. They're also looking to find bottlenecks. They want to evaluate risks and improve decision making. And that's a very different application than what most people think about when they hear the term artificial intelligence. Then I came over another initiative that's talking about something called Gold Eagle. Gold Eagle. And again, the goal wasn't simply to use AI because it's popular. The objective was to improve cybersecurity by helping identify vulnerabilities more efficiently and allowing agencies to share that information more effectively as well. Then I also read about Oracle's enterprise software agreement with the Department of Defense, and at first, I thought it was simply another software contract. But after reading further, I realized that the bigger story wasn't Oracle itself. The bigger story was that the Department of Defense appears to be moving toward more standardized and more standardized enterprise-wide software solutions instead of every agency buying software independently. And they're looking for ways to improve interoperability. They want to reduce complexity and strengthen cybersecurity across multiple organizations. And when I step back, I realize something. These are not isolated stories, they're all connected. And artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, cloud computing, enterprise software, supply chain visibility, and data, these are all different pieces of the Department of Defense's modernization efforts. And that matters because defense companies don't operate in a vacuum. They respond to the priorities established by the government. Now, naturally, once those priorities are identified, the next question then becomes who is going to pay for all of this? And that's where Congress enters the picture. And one thing that I learned reading through budget proposals is that there's a common misconception about how defense spending actually works. And people often hear headlines like the administration proposes a $1 trillion defense budget. And when they hear something like that, they assume that's automatically what the military receives. But that's not necessarily how the process works because the president proposes a budget, the Department of Defense outlines its priorities, but Congress ultimately decides what gets funded through the appropriate process. And lawmakers debated the proposals, they make changes, and some programs receive more funding while others receive less. And some priorities move forward while others do not. So while presidential budget requests are certainly important, they're only part of a much larger process. And another thing that stood out to me was something called a continuing resolution or a CR. And if Congress has not passed a new appropriations bill before funding expires, they'll often pass a continuing resolution. And in simple terms, that usually allows the government to continue operating temporarily while lawmakers continue negotiating a final budget. And for defense companies, that can matter because continuing resolutions may delay the start of certain new programs or affect the timing of some procurement activities. And it doesn't necessarily mean that those programs disappear, but it can influence when funding becomes available. And to be clear, again, it's another reminder that defense investing isn't simply about reading company press releases. It's about understanding the broader environment those companies operate within. And as I kept reading, another theme became incredibly obvious. And it's that software is no longer just software, and cybersecurity is no longer just cybersecurity. Artificial intelligence is also not just artificial intelligence anymore, and these technologies are increasingly being treated as matters of national security. And when the government begins treating something as a national security priority, companies operating in those areas naturally receive more attention from investors. Now, that doesn't mean that every cybersecurity company will succeed, and it doesn't mean that every AI company will win contracts, and it certainly doesn't guarantee that every stock in these industries is a good investment. But it does help explain why investors spend so much time watching these sectors, because government priorities often shape future procurement opportunities. And that's where things started getting really interesting for me. And once Congress approves funding, the once Congress does approve funding, that money, people do ask, how does that money actually get into the hands of defense contractors? Uh, could it be that some people may be asking, does the Pentagon simply call a company and write them a check? And the thing about it is that wouldn't be the case because there's an entire procurement process that takes place behind the scenes. Companies have to qualify, they have to compete, they have to submit proposals, and they have to meet cybersecurity requirements. and they also have to earn the government's trust before they're ever awarded work. And understanding that process completely changed the way I look at the defense industry. So in the next part, I'm going to be walking through something called RFIs. I'm also going to be walking through sources sought notices, solicitations, IDIQs, GWACS, GWACs, and what task orders actually are. So the thing is, we've reached the point where Congress has approved funding for certain priorities. Maybe it's cybersecurity, maybe it's artificial intelligence, or maybe even it's logistics modernization, or maybe it's upgrading software across the Department of Defense. Now, the obvious question becomes, how does the government actually find the companies that are going to do that work? Because contrary to what a lot of people think, the Pentagon doesn't just wake up one minute and randomly hand out contracts. There's actually a structured procurement process that usually takes months and sometimes even years. And understanding the process completely changed the way I looked at defense companies. So, starting at the very beginning, first off, we're going to be talking about something called RFIs, which stands for Request for Information. Now, despite the name, this isn't the government asking companies to bid on a contract, but instead, we're thinking about they're basically saying that they're thinking about buying something. But before they decide exactly what it is they need, they want to hear from the industry, and you need to think of it like someone wanting to build a house, because before they hire a contractor, they might ask several builders what is possible. How much would the job actually cost, and what are the latest technologies available? And that's essentially what an RFI is. It's the government gathering information before deciding exactly how to structure a future procurement. Now, after that, we might come across something called sources sought notice. And it sounds similar to an RFI, but it's actually a little different, because instead of asking what's possible, the government asks a different question. They start to ask who out there is actually capable of doing this work. And companies will then submit capability statements explaining their experience, their certifications, their personnel, their past performance, and why they believe they are qualified. And this step helps the government understand what the competitive landscape looks like. And sometimes it also helps determine whether a contract should be reserved for small businesses, or if they are opened up to larger contractors as well. And then comes something called pre-solicitation notice. And I want you to think of it as an announcement that the government is basically telling industry, we're planning to release an official opportunity soon. And they might include an estimated value, a rough timeline, or the general scope of the work. And for investors, this can actually be pretty interesting because it tells you where future spending may be headed long before any contract is awarded. And eventually, the official solicitation is released, and this is where things become much more serious because the government now knows what it wants, and they have defined the requirements, and they've established the evaluation criteria, and they're inventing qualified companies to compete. And one of the most common types of solicitations you'll hear about is an RFP, or request for proposal. And this is where companies spend weeks, sometimes even months, putting together detailed proposals. They're not just submitting a price, they're explained exactly how they'll perform the work and how they'll start the project and their technical approach and their previous experience, along with their schedule and their cybersecurity compliance, and why the government should choose them compared to choosing someone else. And here's something I didn't fully appreciate until I started reading more procurement documents, and it's that winning these contracts isn't always about offering the lowest price. The government often evaluates multiple factors. They also evaluate technical capability, past performance, and management's approach. And they also want to go over the risks, the security requirements, the price, and depending on the contract, those factors can vary, can carry different levels of importance. Now, eventually, after all those proposals have been reviewed, the government announces an award, and this is where many investors stop paying attention because they see the headline, they buy the stock, and assume the company just landed a massive payday. But here's where things get even more interesting because not every contract is worth the same. And one of the terms that you'll hear often in the industry, in the defense industry, is IDIQ, which stands for Indefinite Delivery, Indefinite Quantity. And I know that's a mouthful. It gave me a little bit of a tongue twister there, but the concept is actually pretty straightforward. And IDIQ isn't usually one guaranteed contract. It's more like creating a list of pre-approved companies that can compete for future work. And here's an analogy that helped me understand it better. It's imagine that the government is organizing a basketball tournament. Before the games can even begin, teams have to qualify, and winning a spot on an IDIQ is kind of like qualifying for that tournament. You've earned the right to compete, but you haven't won the championship yet. And the actual games, or in this case, the task orders, come afterwards. And that's where the real revenue starts getting generated. And this distinction is incredibly important because sometimes you'll see headlines that say something like company is awarded a $250 million contract, but if it's a multiple award IDIQ, that does not necessarily mean that the company is going to receive $250 million. The number is often the maximum ceiling value for the entire contract vehicle, shared among multiple awardees. What actually matters is how many task orders that company wins over time. And another term that you'll see is MAC, or is multiple award contract, short for MAC. And this simply means the government selected multiple qualified companies instead of just one. Now, the reason they would do that, if you are asking that, is because different companies do have different strengths. One company, they might specialize in cybersecurity, while another might be stronger in software engineering, and another might have unique logistics experience. And by selecting several contractors, the government creates competition throughout the life of the program while maintaining flexibility. Then there are GWACs, and this stands for government-wide acquisition contracts. And they work similarly to IDIQs, but instead of serving one agency, they can often be used by many different federal agencies across the government. And that is why companies get excited when they win positions on major GWACs. And it's not because revenue is guaranteed, it's because they've gained access to a much larger pool of potential opportunities. Quick reminder before we continue, if you're enjoying the content and want to connect with the community, check out the first link below for the free InvestQ community. And if you want access to advanced stock research and tools, the second link is a Prophecy 7-day trial for just $7. And last, if you want daily market updates and behind the scenes content, follow me on Instagram using the third link in the description. Now, let's get back to the video. Now, bringing this back to Castellum CTM for a moment, one example that we have discussed on this channel is the Navy LIIS contract vehicle with the total ceiling value being at $250 million. And at first glance, someone might think, wow, Castellum just landed a $250 million contract. But that's not actually what happened. The LIIS program is a multiple award contract, and Castellum's joint venture earned a position on that vehicle. And that means it's now eligible to compete for future task orders issued under that program. And those task orders are what can actually turn into backlog, revenue, and earnings. So instead of asking, what's the ceiling value? I think the better question for investors is how much work can this company realistically win over the life of the contract? There's a much more meaningful way to evaluate the opportunity. And once I understood the distinction, a lot of defense headlines suddenly made much more sense, and I stopped looking at contract announcements as guaranteed revenue. Instead, I started seeing them as new opportunities that companies still have to execute on. Now, there's one more piece of the puzzle that we do need to understand, because even if a company has incredible technology, even if it has talented engineers, and even if it wants to bid on these contracts, that still doesn't mean that it's eligible. Because over the last several years, the Department of Defense has dramatically increased its cybersecurity requirements for contractors. And that brings us to one of the most important topics in modern defense procurement, CMMC. Because for many companies, cybersecurity isn't just a competitive advantage anymore. It's becoming a requirement just to get in the door. So now we know how governments award contracts, how companies respond to RFIs, how they submit proposals, how they compete for IDIQs, and hopefully they win task orders that eventually become revenue. But here's something I didn't fully appreciate until I started digging much deeper, and it's not every company is even allowed to compete, because a defense contractor can bid on many Department of Defense opportunities, and they first have to prove they can protect sensitive government information. And that's where cybersecurity comes in, because years ago, companies could almost treat cybersecurity as another selling point. It was something nice to have, and it was something that might help you differentiate from competitors. And today, that's changing, because cybersecurity is increasingly becoming a requirement. And one of the biggest examples is what I just mentioned, the CMMC, which stands for Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. Now, I know that sounds very technical, but the concept is actually pretty simple, because imagine that the Department of Defense wants to hire someone to help manage sensitive military information. Would you want that information stored on a unsecured computer? Probably not. In fact, I'm not even going to say probably not. It's most definitely not. The government feels the exact same way that with the response that you had to it. Because if they're going to handle controlled unclassified information, often called CUI, or other sensitive government data, the Department of Defense wants confidence that those companies have strong cybersecurity practices in place. That's what CMMC is designed to accomplish, and it's essentially a cybersecurity verification process instead of simply taking a company's word for it. And the government increasingly wants independent confirmation that certain security standards have been met. And that's really an important shift, because CMMC isn't necessarily designed to make companies better investments. It's designed to reduce cybersecurity risk throughout the defense industrial base. Now, why this matters to investors is because if cybersecurity becomes a prerequisite for many future contracts, then companies that invest in meeting those requirements may be better positioned to compete for certain opportunities than companies that don't. And that doesn't guarantee that they'll win contracts, but it can determine whether they're even eligible to compete. And that is a huge difference. And one thing that really stood out during my research was how often cybersecurity kept showing up, because no matter what article I was reading, whether if it involved artificial intelligence, supply chains, software modernization, or procurement, cybersecurity was always somewhere in the conversation. And that tells me that this is not just a temporary trend, it's starting to become the foundation of how the Department of Defense wants to operate moving forward. Then going back, because again, we mentioned Gold Eagle with this one right here, but going back to it, um, I'll be honest, I had no idea what it was when I first started doing research. But after reading through the information, I realized that the broader concept was actually pretty fascinating, because the idea is to use artificial intelligence to help identify and organize cybersecurity vulnerabilities much more efficiently. So think about how many software systems, how many applications, how many networks and devices the federal government operates every single day. It's absolutely enormous, because in trying to manually identify each vulnerability across that entire environment would be incredibly difficult. And artificial intelligence has the potential to help prioritize those risks. It has the potential to identify platforms, and it has the potential to make cybersecurity teams more efficient. And again, artificial intelligence isn't replacing cybersecurity professionals, it's helping them work smarter. And while I was finishing the research, another story caught my attention that I think fits perfectly into the discussion because, according to Wall Street Journal, companies including Nvidia, Microsoft, Palantir, SpaceX, and several others announced a new initiative called Open Source AI. Uh, open, I'm sorry, Open Secure AI Alliance. And the announcement that came out on July 27, 2026, after a reported AI-related security incident involving Hugging Face, and the goal of the alliance is to develop open source tools that helps organizations defend AI-powered cyber attacks. Now, this doesn't directly involve Castellum. There wasn't a new CTM contract announced, and I'm not saying that this automatically is bullish for the company, but what it does show is that some of the biggest technology companies in the world are now treating AI as a security major priority. And think about how quickly artificial intelligence has evolved. For years, everyone focused on what AI could create. And today, another question is becoming just as important. How do we protect ourselves from AI being used maliciously? That's becoming an entirely new area of cybersecurity. And I think that's one of the biggest themes investors should be paying attention to. Artificial intelligence isn't replacing cybersecurity, it's actually increasing the need for cybersecurity because the more powerful AI becomes, the more important it becomes to secure those systems. And that's another article, and another article that also caught my attention is involving Oracle, because at first I assumed it was just another software contract, but after reading deeper, I realized that the bigger story wasn't Oracle itself. It was how the Department of Defense wants to purchase softwares in the future, and historically, different military branches often purchase software independently, and one agency negotiated one agreement, another agency negotiated a different agreement, and someone else purchased something entirely different, and over time, that can create unnecessary complexity and different systems, different security standards, different licensing agreements, and different update schedules. And what the government appears to be moving towards is a more centralized approach in certain areas. And instead of everyone operating independently, enterprise-wide agreements can help improve interoperability, it can help reduce costs, simplify cybersecurity management, and standardize software across multiple organizations. And when I read that, it made me realize something. Software is no longer just software for the Department of Defense. Software is becoming increasingly critical infrastructure. Just like roads, bridges, or military bases, secure softwares now play an essential role in national security. And once you understand that, a lot of these investments begin making much more sense. And then there was another executive order that discussed using artificial intelligence to improve supply chain visibility. And this one really stood out to me. Think about how complicated modern defense manufacturing has become. One aircraft, one radar, or one military communication system might contain components from hundreds or even thousands of suppliers. Now imagine one critical supplier experiences a disruption. Maybe it could be a natural disaster or maybe some type of geopolitical issue. Maybe it's a cyber attack, and whatever the cause of the disruption could be, that disruption can affect the entire supply chain. And the government wants better visibility into those risks before they become major problems. And artificial intelligence can help analyze massive amounts of supply chain data. It can help identify vulnerabilities and highlight potential bottlenecks much faster than traditional manual processes. Excuse me. And again, the theme is becoming very consistent. Artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, software, data, and supply chains aren't separate stories. They're all connected. They're different pieces of the same modernization effort. And another thing that I found interesting is that several of those government documents also emphasized accountability. And it's not just about awarding contracts anymore. Contractors are increasingly expected to maintain strong cybersecurity practices throughout the life of those contracts, and failure to do so can have serious consequences depending on the circumstances. And that's another reminder that cybersecurity isn't simply an IT department issue, it's a business issue, it's a compliance issue, and for defense contractors, it's becoming a competitive issue as well. Now, let's bring it back to Castellum CTM for just a moment, because one reason that investors often discuss Castellum CTM's CMMC capabilities isn't just because CMMC automatically creates revenue. It doesn't, but instead, the argument is that maintaining those cybersecurity capabilities may help position the company to pursue opportunities that require those standards. Now, whether Castellum ultimately wins those contracts depends on many factors, including competition, pricing, technical capability, past performance, and the government's evaluation process. But eligibility matters, and you can't win contracts you aren't allowed to compete for. And I do think that one of the biggest lessons I learned from researching all of this is that winning contracts doesn't start with a press release. It starts years earlier with cybersecurity investments, compliance, building technical expertise, hiring qualified employees, establishing past performance, and providing the government that you're capable of protecting sensitive information. And only after that does the procurement process we talked about earlier really begin. So now we've connected the major pieces of the puzzle. We understand why national security priorities matter, and we understand how budgets get approved, and we understand how procurement works as well. Now, we understand why cybersecurity and artificial intelligence are becoming increasingly important, but there is still one question left. Once companies are actually eligible to compete, how do we compare them? How do we evaluate whether one defense contractor might be better positioned than another? And that's exactly what we're going to explore now as we take a closer look at Castellum and its competitors and how it fits into the broader defense industry. So I wanted to research one step further. Instead of just asking who competes with Castellum, I wanted to ask how does Castellum actually stack up financially against those competitors? Because at the end of the day, investors, they don't buy companies simply because they operate in a good industry. They buy companies because they believe management can execute better than anybody else. So I compared Castellum against three companies that operate in very similar areas of federal IT. In federal IT, cybersecurity, and defense services. And those companies would be Telos, ticker symbol TLS, WidePoint, hold on. WidePoint, ticker symbol, WidePoint, recent quarterly results. Yeah, there we go. Yeah. So yeah, WidePoint, ticker symbol WYY, and then CSP Incorporated. And there is one thing that surprised me because even though Castellum is the smallest company by market cap, its recent financial performance actually compares surprisingly well in several categories. So looking at the revenue growth, when I compared these companies, when I compared all the different companies, Telos recently, and again, please do your own due diligence. But Telos recently reported revenue growth of roughly 56%. Castellum recently reported approximately 23%. WYY came in around 21%, while CSP reported around 22%. Now, obviously, Telos had the strongest quarter, but Castellum was still growing faster than some other companies operating in a similar niche, and that doesn't automatically make it the better investment, but it tells me demand for Castellum services appear to be growing. Next would be profitability, and what was actually pretty interesting is that WidePoint recently became profitable, CSP is profitable, Telos beat earnings expectations, and Castellum, although not yet consistently profitable, has been getting significantly closer. So rather than seeing an industry full of struggling companies, I actually found something different because many of these smaller federal IT contractors appear to be moving towards stronger profitability at roughly the same time. That could suggest that this isn't just a Castellum story, it could be an industry trend. Then I looked at gross margins, and gross margins matter because they tell us how much money a company keeps after delivering its products and services. And Castellum's gross margins compares fairly well against several peers. And again, it's not proof that the stock is undervalued, but another data point is showing that they're operating in a competitive range. Next would be the balance sheet, and I checked their debt because government contracting is not cheap. Companies, they need engineers, cleared personnel, proposal writers, software, security infrastructure before they ever generate revenue. So balance sheets matter. And one thing I noticed is that several of these companies maintain relatively healthy balance sheets. WidePoint reported no bank debt. CSP maintains a strong cash position. Telos has continued improving financially, and Castellum has dramatically improved its own balance sheet over the past year. And again, this doesn't guarantee future success, but it gives companies more flexibility to pursue opportunities without constantly worrying about survival. And after looking through all these reports, one thing became pretty obvious to me. The companies competing in this space aren't sitting still. They're hiring, they're growing, they're winning contracts, they're improving margins, building recurring revenue, strengthening cybersecurity, expanding cloud services, winning new government work, and Castellum has to compete against all of them. And that's exactly why management's execution matters so much. It's not enough to simply operate in cybersecurity anymore. You have to consistently constantly outperform other highly specialized government contractors. And one thing that investors also mention all the time is backlog, because this is another area where Castellum really stands out. Castellum's backlog recently exceeded roughly $273 million. Now remember, the backlog is not cash and it isn't guaranteed future revenue. Instead, it's contracted work that management expects to perform over time according to the terms of those contracts. So think of backlog like a restaurant reservation book. And those reservations don't automatically become revenue until customers actually show up and eat, but it does provide investors with visibility into future business. And finally, we have pipeline. And their pipeline isn't backlog, the pipeline isn't revenue, and pipeline is simply management's estimate of future opportunities they're actively pursuing. Some of it will become contracts, while some of it won't, but that's just the nature of competitive bidding. But when you combine backlog, the pipeline, IDIQs, GWACs, and task order opportunities, you begin seeing something much bigger than one quarterly earnings report. You begin seeing how management is positioning the business several years into the future. So let me know what it is you think about Castellum CTM in the comment section below, and tell me what you want to see in future upcoming videos. But with that being said, guys, David over here at InvestQ out. Feel free to hit the like and subscribe button, and I'll see you on the next video.